This is a sellout crowd, as you can see, which is a testament to the popularity of our featured guest and the enduring appeal of his lucid, incisive, and informed commentary about much of what's happening to us and around us. Paul Krugman's academic achievements alone add up to an impressive contribution to humanity. His work in international trade and finance led to a Nobel Prize in 2008, and he taught at Yale, MIT, Stanford, and Princeton before joining the faculty several years ago at City University of New York. But Paul also has had an impact well beyond academia because of his great ability to write about economics and other sometimes complicated issues in a way that many people can understand. He's authored or edited more than 24 books, and he's been a prolific writer of columns and articles, including the twice-weekly New York Times column that he's been churning out for 20 years. As he says at the opening of his new book, he hadn't envisioned becoming a pundit when he finished graduate school and embarked on an academic career. Even after starting to compose monthly columns for Fortune and Slate in the later 1990s, Paul considered himself mainly a nonpartisan research economist and dispassionate analyst. But the commentary in his New York Times columns have become more pointed, fierce, and biting over the years. As a result, he says, of the nature of arguments made on the other side, arguments increasingly divorced from facts and data. In this increasingly evidence-free, truth-denying environment, Paul finds himself, as the title of his new book puts it, arguing with zombies, meaning continually confronting what he calls ideas that should have been killed by contrary evidence, but instead keep shambling along, eating people's brains. Such death-defying notions include, for instance, attempts to privatize Social Security, Republican claims that Obamacare isn't working, and conservative dogma that tax cuts for the rich help the economy. Paul's book is largely a collection of his columns on these and other topics, and it reminds us, as Sebastian Mallaby noted in a review in The Atlantic, how right Paul has been on many of the major issues of recent years and how stubbornly wrong the other side continues to be. In conversation this evening with Paul is Heather Boushey, the president and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, which is a think tank she founded in 2013 to better understand the effects of inequality on economic growth and stability. Heather herself holds a PhD in economics, and her latest book, Unbound, which was published last year, is a timely and useful guide to the most recent economic research on how inequality impedes economic development. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming both Paul Krugman and Heather Boushey.
Okay, so it is just my honor to be able to be up here this evening to interview Paul about this fantastic book. You know, as a regular reader of Paul's columns in the New York Times, when you get a book and you're told, oh, it's a compilation of things that you've already read, most likely, there's a little bit of like, okay, what's new? But I want to, over the course of the next hour as we talk about this, I think one of the things that I really want to pull out that is new is the way that Paul has put this series of pieces that he's done over the past few decades together and tried to make sense of some of the themes and some of the trends and how we think and talk about the economy, what these zombies are. I want to learn about how we can fight the zombies better. What tools do we need? So I think it is really well worth picking up, and if nothing else, it's also just fun to reread some of your favorite columns. So I want to start on with some easy questions, and kind of start with the high notes, and hopefully come back to the high notes by the end of the conversation. So first, what surprised you when you looked back over more than 15 years of columns and you were thinking about how you wanted to put these together in a book, what were you like, wow, I wouldn't have thought that this is a theme or this is something that I want to elevate?
Oh, wow. I guess I wasn't, to some extent I had a picture of the shape of it, so I'm not that surprised by any of it. I think what strikes me is basically just how much the themes, the topics remain the same, but the intensity, the quality of the opposition, if you like, has gone down. So I've been saying, we're going to be talking mostly about economic and analysis here, but each successive Republican president has managed to make his predecessor look good. And so what seemed to me to be, horrible, shocking things that I was writing about during the Bush years now look mild compared with what I'm writing on the same topic now.
Yeah. Well, that's, yes. I don't know what to say. It's been a tough week. It's a tough evening.
Yeah.
I'm glad we're all here. We could be doing other things with our evening.
Yeah.
So you've been this important economist in academia, but this perch that you have at the New York Times really gives you a chance to engage in live policy debates. And I would argue, and I think is some of I think you make clean here, really influenced the course of history in some ways. And so, as we kind of open up this conversation, what are some of the battles that you've taken on where you really do feel that you have made a difference?
Okay. So the first thing to say is that it's very, very rare that you can actually feel that you gave a person with real power advice and actually got it taken. In fact, that has happened clearly, unambiguously to me exactly once. And worse yet, the politician in question was the Prime Minister of Japan, so it wasn't exactly...
Well, so I wonder how many of this audience here in Washington feels the same way. We can take a poll later.
But it's funny, but there have been a couple of places where I think that the wonks, the progressive wonks, Heather is very much part of this same circle, really did make a difference by providing the arguments that people needed. And Social Security privatization, I actually start the book there. The fight against that, I think there was this kind of Beltway consensus. Of course, we need to move. 21st century is this old system needs to be scrapped, and it was really, really important. And I think that a lot of other things played into that, and leadership by much more important people than me, and particularly Nancy Pelosi, were really important on that. But I think that made a difference. Obamacare, we're all talking about how can it be extended, but we're still at risk of having it canceled, and we forget in 2005 is when I started writing about healthcare and how impossible getting what we got seemed at that point. And again, the academic argumentation, but then the bridge building. We were talking about translation versus bridge building. The putting that in a way that a broader public could understand really made a difference. So I do feel there are other places. I spent years arguing against fiscal austerity and feel that I lost that one, despite the fact that there's been no area where I felt as secure that I knew what I was talking about and where the evidence was clear and the political world just ignored that. So you win some and you lose many.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that some of the places where you feel like you've had the most effectiveness, where you think that you've helped spur the conversation in the right direction, really aren't places that were your academic specialties.
Yeah,
it's an interesting.
Well, it's a funny thing because I did my international trade is my original academic home, and then economic geography, which is sort of closely related, but those were until very recently boring policy areas because not much was happening. We had a system of rules. Tariffs were already very low. Yes, we had arguments about NAFTA and so on, but they were not. It was really a pretty low intensity area, and so now that's changed. I mean, there's a certain piece of me that is delighted to see that we've got a crazy trade war underway because it means that my old terrain has become interesting again. But it's just you write about what matters, and so I have to I dedicate the book to the late Uwe Reinhardt, who was a great healthcare economist at Princeton, and for a number of reasons, he's a wonderful person, but also because when I started writing about healthcare, I didn't know beans about healthcare economics. So I was going down the hall to Uwe and saying, Uwe, am I being stupid here? And sometimes the answer was yes. So it was actually really helpful to be able to get some guidance there.
That's so. I mean, tell us a little bit. I'm very curious as an economist who seeks to engage in the public sphere. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how you pick your topics each week. You just said you write about what matters. How do you think about it? And then particularly, so both how do you think about it, but then a specific sub-question is, when you're choosing topics, how much do you think about whether or not you want to kind of preach to the choir or buttress up, give better arguments to people that might already agree with you, versus how much are you thinking about really trying to convince people who might not already be inclined to agree with your argument?
Okay, so that depends a lot on the subject. So on something like, all right, a lot of it is preaching to the choir, or more the point, actually giving hymns to the choir that they can sing to other people, right? So it's about providing arguments. And the reality of American political economy right now is that there's a large block of people who are completely unreachable. First of all, in the first place, even the New York Times reaches maybe 1% of the population. So in terms of the size of the platform, it's as big as you're going to get in journalism, but it's not that big. And then but even more to the point, you have a whole political universe that is completely resistant to evidence, argument of any kind, and certainly nothing that I can say. But there are some places, there are some people in the middle. I think you can actually move a little bit. I think we can get some shift in. We have actually measurably moved the discussion. There is the centrists within the Democratic Party, what we now call centrists, look a whole lot like fairly progressives from 15 years ago. So you can in fact move things. So there's some persuasion, but a lot of it is just you're reminding people just how bad some arguments are, and giving them a better way to express their what they probably already believe, but they may not have figured out the right words for it. So,
because we're mixing all of our metaphors here, I am mixing them up in my questioning. But we're fighting zombies with hymns. Is kind of what I just
there we are.
Okay, so we'll come back to that as we keep going through this conversation. So. One of the things that you talk about is that you have this list of punditry rules for yourself. And one of them is to quote, "Don't be afraid to talk about motives." Yeah. And you definitely criticize people on all sides. It seems like a lot of I read you that you're looking for truth. You're not afraid to call out sort of bad arguments on all sides. But how do you tell us a little bit more about how you think about applying this to your writing, and this question of talking about motive, and why did you think it was important to tell us that? Like, why? I mean,
okay, you're going to be ineffective in these days. Maybe you're going to be ineffective regardless, but you're certainly going to be ineffective arguing in the public sphere if you pretend that we're actually having across the board, that we're actually having honest debate. A lot of it is not. A lot of the arguments that you hear are in bad faith. So if we talk about the dispute about the 2017 tax cut, this was not a case of, well, some serious people think it's a good idea and some serious people think it's a bad idea. It was sold with lies. And then you need, if you're going to acknowledge that, and I think you're being unfair to your readers if you don't say that, then you are also really being unfair to your readers if you don't explain why people are willing to say these things. I mean, so so think about something. I'm mixing subjects here, but think about monetary policy, which actually you probably shouldn't. But anyway, it's one of those topics that is really probably often not suitable, but it sometimes it is. So there are real disputes in monetary policy. Ben Bernanke and I are somewhat in disagreement about the effectiveness of quantitative easing. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, consider yourself lucky. That's a perfectly fine debate, and I would never question his motives. But if we were having in the early 2010s, a debate about whether the Fed's efforts to rescue the economy were going to lead to hyperinflation, it was important not just to say that this is really crazy, that's not going to happen, but to ask who is it, why are people saying this? Because there was nobody making those claims who wasn't effectively a paid political operative. And some of them may have had an economics PhD, or at least called themselves economics, but nonetheless, in fact, it was all hired guns. And you need to say that you're not being honest with your readers if you don't say that.
Well, and I think, and that'll get to some themes that I want to keep coming back to. I want to switch gears a little bit. There were a number of greatest hits that I really enjoyed in here, but one that I had not read before that I really enjoyed was the 1993 piece that you did called How I Work. And, one of the things that, in there you trace out the arc of how you've thought about your work over time. And one thing that you noted is that you've always seen live policy debates as fodder for your deeper economic thinking. So even before you became a pundit. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to just tell us, of the policy topics that you've worked on over your career, which have given you, of the live policy debates, which have been the ones that have come back into your thinking about theory in the ways that have been most influential on your own thinking?
Oh, wow. I'm going to give you two. So there were two... what I personally consider the best academic paper I ever wrote was actually about Japan. And it was a little over 20 years ago, writing about Japan being stuck in this trap, being unable to get out of deflation. And I was among the people who looked at Japan and I came into it. I started thinking about it. I thought the Japanese were being stupid, that there has to be a really easy answer to this. And in the course of researching it and trying to think it through and looking at the data, I realized that, actually this is really hard. It's not, the Japanese are not being stupid, and it could happen to us, which in fact it did 10 years later. So so that's a case where looking at an actual policy issue, which is the troubles of Japan, led me into really rethinking, understanding that we did not have this recession economic slump thing under control, that it was not a solved problem as many economists thought at the time. The other area, which I'm not even sure I wrote about it in this book, but the minimum wage, very few things in economic research have shaken me as much as the empirical research on the effects of minimum wage increases, which turns out to be one of the few places in economics. We don't get to do very many experiments in economics. Human experimentation is generally frowned upon, but we get a lot of natural experiments when states or cities raise their minimum wage, and you can compare what happens there with what happens in neighboring cities. And there's this classic work, which has not been replicated and extended many times, from 1993 by David Card and Alan Kruger, where they found out that contrary to what Econ 101 would say, you cannot see any job losses from those minimum wage increases. And that was just shook said, okay, maybe the economy works a lot less like, I knew that Econ 101 was an imperfect, incomplete story, but maybe it's a lot more imperfect and incomplete than I realized it was.
Yeah, I mean, Well, I have two comments. One, that is such a pivotal moment, I think, in economics, and so much of the work we're doing at Equitable Growth is building on that. The ideas of how all of this new empirical data and evidence is changing the way we think about theory. But I'm also glad I asked you this question because now I know why you've spent so much time in your columns focusing on the Japan slump. It was important, but also it's nice to hear you talk about how you thought it was important. I'm having fun up here is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, this is great. So keeping on the same theme here. So, recently when you were talking about your book, you told the American Prospect, quote, "I'm considerably less of a believer in the invisible hand and more concerned about power than when I was younger." And that just really struck me as we've been doing our work at Equitable Growth, and I've been thinking about what the data and the research and the evidence means, and thinking about Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand, which he calls it's the divine. It's this kindly, gentle hand that's pushing the economy towards optimal outcomes, where everyone has this mutual beneficial exchange. And as I've been thinking about it, the image that I now have in my head of the invisible hand is actually, maybe most of you will get this. In the 80s, there were these ads on television for Hamburger Helper, and there was this hand in this glove that I think was a little traumatizing for me, but it had this smiley face, but it looked kind of cruel. And so in my head, I now imagine the invisible hand. It's like pushing some people up, it's shoving other people aside, and it's punching down. Right? It's not this kindly hand. This is the way I'm thinking about it. So my question for you is, does this image resonate with you? What does it mean to you to say you're less of a believer in the invisible hand?
Okay. So first of all, I should say that the British magazine Prospect would probably be a little bit upset at being called the American Prospect.
Sorry.
Anyway, it's funny, actually, Hamburger Helper. So this is, I associate Hamburger Helper with my apprenticeship as an economist because I spent a couple of summers working as a research assistant and in the 70s and eating a lot of Hamburger Helper. But anyway, Adam Smith wasn't that certain that the invisible hand was benign. But he was just saying that things. The logic of the system is but the belief that markets get it right, and that markets, and particularly that there's kind of a uniquely determined thing. This is what the market wants to happen, and defy the market at your peril. Now, I never fully believed in that, but it's become increasingly hard to the weight that you want to put on that view, actually the central issue there is inequality. There was an orthodoxy which to some extent I shared, but have progressively moved away from in a couple of sentences, was that rising inequality was because of these anonymous forces, that the technological, we've got Larry Michelle up here, skill bias technological change was pushing us towards greater inequality. And that has looked worse and worse as a story about what actually happened. And so you actually start to ask things like, okay, why are CEOs paid so much? And the proximate answer is, well, their pay is decided by compensation committees that they basically appoint. But that was always true. So what was it? What changed between the 60s and the world we live in now that caused those compensation committees to start paying them 300 times as much as their workers instead of 20 times as much as their workers? So that's the sense in which, we see that across a lot of fronts. Now, we're having a hard time. It's kind of a grab bag of different stories here, but somehow clearly it's not just that the market wants something. There's clearly a lot of wiggle room in outcomes that seems to depend on things that at some level are power.
Well, and I think it's this grab bag of different stories. That's where I see economics right now.
Yeah.
You've talked about the Card and Kruger work. We have all of this new empirical research, a lot of which where we're looking at what inequality means across different vectors and then trying to understand what that means for economic outcomes. But it does feel like there is still these questions of what it means for theory. How do we take all of this new research and evidence? And, I think this will go into this next question here. So in one of your pieces from August of 2018, so recently, called Capitalism, Socialism, and Unfreedom, you focus on, and I wanted to quote this because you labeled it, quote, "What's wrong with the neoliberal ideology that has dominated so much of the public discourse since the 1970s? And you argue that, quote, "the idea that free markets remove power relations from the equation is just naive." And so I wondered if you could spend a couple of minutes on, how is it that you think about integrating power into economic theory? I'm sure it's kind of connected to the grab bag and the invisible hand, but if you could focus just for a moment on, when you say it's naive to not, that free markets can remove power relations, how do you think about integrating that into theory, into economics?
Okay, it's really hard, right? I mean, the thing about economics, and for what Heather knows and the economists in the room know, is that we have this sort of baseline economic theory, which is sort of supply and demand, but in a much extended version, which is beautiful. All the pieces fit together, and it gives you answers to everything, and so it has aesthetics going for it. It has a kind of intellectual satisfaction. It's got everything going for it, except actually that's not true. And
details.
But even people like even those of us who know it's not true tend to do stuff where we start with that as a baseline and then say, okay, but let's tweak it a bit. So we'll introduce some monopolies into it, or let's tweak it a bit and let's introduce some realistic features of labor markets. And the trouble, two problems. One is the which ways that you should tweak it it's very hard to come up with those, except on a case-by-case basis. So I'm not sure if you had asked me where I thought that empirical work would say that Econ 101 got it really wrong, I wouldn't have picked minimum wages as the place, but that turns out to be where the compelling evidence is. So it's very much still, here's something we found. It's not necessarily what you thought. It doesn't. We don't have an integrated theory. We just have a whole lot of mixing metaphors, a menagerie of particular cases. So it's the short answer is that I'm just much more willing to pay attention to evidence that says that we've got it wrong, but I don't have a general theory of power. I mean, this is a long way off, but listen to what the data says, and listen. Actually, that 93 essay was actually about writing academic economics, but it was also about being willing to listen to people with heterodox views who don't necessarily speak your language. And the way I actually put it, which seems appropriate here, was listen to the Gentiles.
Yeah. I noted that was seemed appropriate. That's for tonight. Well, I mean, I think it is interesting, and for anybody who might be here in the audience who wants to think about a career in economics, I think that this is a very exciting question and something that we're going to have to continue to grapple with. So that's just my pitch for people to come and help the profession. I will also note that my favorite piece that you've ever written was the one called "Mistaking Beauty for Truth," and so I recommend that. That's in here. That it kind of gets at some of these themes. So I wanted. Actually, I'm going to go to this next. So I wanted to go back to this 93. Essay for just a moment and quote something that you said. Let me just find it. I have way more questions that I could possibly ask in an hour, so I just skipped one. We'll have to get back to it later. So in this 93 essay, and when you trace your intellectual history, you talk about how you learned that your talent was to make complex ideas into simple models by reframing the question. Yeah. Among other things. And I thought that was a really interesting self-awareness. And I want to quote from the book, where you're telling the reader how you develop trade models where economies of scale could be an independent cause of international trade, even the absence of comparative advantage. And you say, this paragraph where you say, I was of course, quote, I was of course only saying something that critics of conventional theory had been saying for decades, yet my point was not part of mainstream international economics. Why? Because it had never been expressed in nice models. And a little ellipse here, quote, I suddenly realized the remarkable extent to which the methodology of economics creates blind spots. We just don't see what we can't formalize. And then you go on to explain how that was important in this. But as I was reading this and thinking about both your statements about the invisible hand, our thinking about that, these questions about power, I wondered if you could, do you think that power is a big blind spot for economics?
Oh, sure. I mean, a little bit less blind than it was, but it was, if I think about the way that, well, people like me, vaguely center-left, but economics-trained people thought about the world 20, 25 years ago, it really didn't leave much room for power. It was really that this was basically a functioning market, supply and demand, and then yes, you wanted to have some government policies to mitigate some of the injustices and harshness of it, but didn't think very much at all about the role of monopolies. Didn't think very much about I think I was probably always for higher minimum wages, but assumed that there'd be a cost in terms of jobs. Always had some sympathy for unions, but didn't thought of them as having a lot of downsides, much more than I do now. And just generally, we really got we bought into the idea that the invisible hand, that the logic of the marketplace severely constrains what happens, and that looks a lot less persuasive now.
So one more theory question, and then I want to talk about what all this means for how we kill the zombies. But one more theory question about macro. So you've talked about, and you have this nice piece in here from 2010 where you called The Instability of Moderation, where you point out that a key problem for macroeconomics has been this search for microfoundations, and that we weren't able to find those in a way that worked, microeconomics being about rational economic actors and rapidly clearing markets relative to macro where there's frictions and ad hoc behavior. And I wondered if you could comment on something else that I'm seeing happening now, which is the reverse. In that we're seeing a lot of young scholars, a new generation of scholars who are using microeconomic data to build up to do macroeconomic theory. And I wonder if you see any hope for developing a more cohesion between micro and macro, from the micro to the macro, rather than from the trying to find the microfoundations.
Okay, so the microfoundations, I think maybe I should do a little. Microfoundations was the idea that we have this idealized Homo economicus, economic man who's perfectly rational and is and operates in perfect markets, and it's a metaphor that has proved useful, but then ends up. The trouble with it is that people are always tempted to go too far with it, and there was for most of my professional life, we were in a situation where people basically the things that happen in recessions couldn't happen if people were as rational and markets were as efficient as this theory says. And so you would say, so that means you're going to change the theory, right? But what actually happened was that about half the profession said, that means that the things that happen don't actually happen. So we created this idealized world where, what are you going to believe, the theory or your lying eyes? And I hope that we've moved back from that more, though there's still quite a lot of that. One of the shocking things to me has been how little adjustment in doctrine took place after the financial crisis. It's amazing to me how many people, maybe we should have known that, right? It's this old line about science, that science progresses funeral by funeral. Basically, nobody ever admits that they were wrong about anything. But but I think what you're getting at is what we're now tending to do in academic economics is we're getting lots and lots of of work with data, work with real cases. And the problem always with that, actually there are two problems with it. One is that knowing how an individual market works doesn't necessarily tell you how the whole ensemble works. There can be real fallacies of composition. So looking at what goes on it can be very, very wrong. I mean, actually, in some ways that's what macro is all about. Because if you say, is it good for an individual to save and be thrifty, and the answer is, well, yes. Is it good if everybody tries to spend less than their income at the same time? The answer is that's a depression. But the other problem is that you get this accumulation of cases, and it's always tricky to know whether they generalize. You end up knowing, you learn a lot about, I mean, with there's a prize that's actually harder to get than Nobel, called the Clark Medal. It's given to an economist under 40. And so we've had stuff, there's some wonderful work on the impact of increased access to global markets, driven by the expansion of the railway network in India in the 19th century. That's great, but how sure are we that what we learn from Indian railway networks is actually applicable to the coronavirus, let's say? When I was an undergrad, I took a course in computer science, and it's a very primitive artificial intelligence efforts then, and people, I remember very much the line that we thought we could learn to understand intelligence by teaching computers to play chess, and what we ended up was learning a lot about chess, and that's kind of the problem. That's the great worry with all this proliferation of which we need, but it's a judgment call. So some of this stuff I think is tremendously relevant, and but never sure.
Okay, again, so now I want to move on to the zombies that keep us up at night. And core to this book and to your columns is, and you already talked about it, the one-sided nature of the current debate, in the sense that there's polarization, but it's asymmetric. Right. And we need to understand the motives on both sides. And in a piece from October of 2018, you wrote, quote, "I submit that the GOP is an authoritarian regime in waiting." And I wrote in my notes here, yikes. So tell us a little bit more about, as I read through the book, it does seem that and part of what I was trying to do in talking about the theory is that there seem to be some parallels between what's happening in economics and what's happening in the way that we talk about economics out in the political sphere. But focusing in on the political sphere, what do you see as the biggest zombies? And do you think that the GOP is the most important one, which is one of the things that I feel like I took from your book?
Well, the zombies are ideas. So a zombie idea is something like tax cuts pay for themselves, which should be dead, but is instead out there eating people's brains. But in principle, those zombie ideas could come from either left or right. But in America in 2020, all of the important zombies are coming from the right. And they're all reflecting the nature of, and I have a section in the book about movement conservatism. It is this interlocking set of institutions, including the Republican Party being actually just sitting in the midst of this set of interlocking institutions, held together largely by money from relative handful of billionaires, but it doesn't take a lot of billionaires to finance a movement, and willing to make deals with racists, with intolerance, in order to advance the interests of these people. And it is extremely scary. Look, we've seen it happened that when I was at Princeton, my next door office neighbor was a constitutional law scholar, and who also happened to be a specialist on Central Europe. And so I was busy sort of tracking the collapse of democracy in Hungary. Mm. And you can just see how that, so Kim Shapley was doing this. She actually spoke Magyar, which Nobody does, but and so she was able to and I actually lent her space on my blog because no one was reporting it. But I got a really pretty firsthand, I was much more aware than the vast majority of people in this country of how it's possible to dismantle a democracy. You can maintain the institutions on paper, but completely subvert them in reality, which happened. Essentially, Hungary is now a one-party authoritarian state. It's a little bit subtle, but it's very real. And frankly, if Trump was as smart as Viktor Orban, we'd probably be lost already. So it scares the hell out of me. It's extremely frightening. We're not very far from that point.
This is the dark part of the conversation.
Sorry.
And so the next thing, in terms of zombies, is that you've said, quote, "To be honest, sometimes I wonder whether I'm wasting my time talking about any issue other than climate change," end quote. I often think that the climate change issue vis-a-vis economics is very interesting because economics is about optimizing given resource constraints, and climate change is so fundamental to that basic idea. But tell us a little bit what you think economists should be focusing on, and where you would like to see the economic profession focus its energy on this question.
Okay, so, first of all, I think we do need to convey that. There's still this notion that somehow environmental costs are not really part of the economy. And I'm not sure that it's all that important whether change the measure of GDP to include those or not, but it is important to highlight the cost. If you look at the fossil fuel industry as a whole, the kind of measurable costs, climate change is only just one of them, but including the direct government subsidies, but also the health costs of air pollution. The fossil fuel industry in the U.S. actually destroys about twice as much value as the total value of wages, profits, and everything else in the industry. So we should be making a point of that. That should be out there. But also, this is a case where I think the invisible hand stuff comes back. Now, Econ 101 is, every Principles of Economics textbook has a chapter on externalities, costs that you impose on people, and how the appropriate solution is to put a price on them. So basically, Economics 101 says we should have carbon taxes. That's actually absolutely standard stuff. But there is still some tendency for our colleagues in the profession to say, and that is the solution and is the only right solution and has to be the core of the solution. And that's not actually right. It certainly should be an important part of it, but there's a lot of reason to believe that there are other things that matter a lot, that investments in infrastructure, investments in technology, and just in general, this issue is so important that we can't afford to be purists. I think the purity test on policy here is wrong anyway, but even if it were right, the important thing is to do something big, and if you have to sell it by packaging it with a lot of other stuff, sure. So basically, I'm a Green New Deal enthusiast for both on the economics and the political economy. It's just, this is no time to say, well, the textbook says we should do it this way, that's the only way.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Yes. So I want to ask you a few questions about what should be in our hymn book. How is it that you're out there every day, not every day, but twice a week, one of the nation's most important economics educators, giving people tools to help both understand the economy and to push back in their own communities on zombie economic ideas. And you have a long list of things that you think are zombies and ways to fight back, but one thing that and you've written a lot about this, that one thing that's important is the language that we use. And so you've noted in a number of your columns about how people might be using the words capitalism or socialism differently. And I'd like to ask you whether or not you think it how you think that matters in communicating to the public when you know that different people are going to have a different sense of, if you say socialism and you look at a poll whether or not people are for it, part of that is different. People have different conceptions of what that is. And so what are you finding the most fruitful ways to deal with these multiple understandings?
Oh boy. I mean, I'm not sure that I even know the answer, because I'm not sure that I found anything that works. I mean, we have... There is unfortunately, we don't really use the term very much in this country, social democracy, which is a sort of standard European parlance for what the Democratic Party stands for these days. It is a mostly market system, but with the government regulation, government moves to empower workers. It's basically Denmark. It's and if you and it would be really helpful if we could use that. Now, we have a long history in this country of anybody proposing anything that sort of mitigates the harshness of the market is accused of being a socialist. And that's one of the, I think it is in the book, there was Operation Coffee Cup in 1961, which was the American Medical Association. It wanted doctors' wives. It was 1961. Doctors' wives were supposed to invite their friends over for coffee to listen to a recording of Ronald Reagan explaining how Medicare would destroy American freedom. And you can listen to it. It's on YouTube. So if you keep on calling any attempt to mitigate, to make lives, basically any attempt to have nice things as socialism, then of course at some point some people start to say, well, in that case I'm a socialist. It does worry me a lot that one of the seriously possible Democratic nominees for president actually plays into that and says, I am a socialist, which he actually isn't. Bernie Sanders is actually a social democrat who is kind of shocking the bourgeoisie by saying I am a socialist. And that, I'm not sure, I kind of understand the appeal of doing that, but I'm not sure that I really want to go into a general election that way. But yeah, there's this tremendous. Okay, no, I mean, I am. Times doesn't allow me to endorse candidates, by the way, not explicitly anyway. And one thing I've been saying is I think that in terms of actual policy, any of the Democrats will be much the same. Yeah. That we're not going to get Medicare for all, no matter who is elected, but we're not going to be getting Republican policies. We're going to be getting significant progressive policies, even if it is a centrist who gets the win. But there's this constant. I mean, the White House, this White House, put out a actually hilarious report on attacking socialism. Hilarious because if they were straining so hard. And one of the things they did was they kept on switching back and forth. Some of the time they were saying that basically it's all Venezuela, and sometimes they were having a really hard time with the Nordic countries. They're having a really hard time with Denmark. And some of the time it says Denmark, well, that's not socialism, so it's okay. And some of the times, well, it is socialism. And then trying to show that socialism is bad, they finally found their decisive chart, which says it's a lot more expensive to own a pickup truck in Sweden than it is in America.
It's an important stat.
Yeah.
Well, you used the term neoliberalism in one of your columns, and you note when you said it, you have a parenthesis that says, oh, this is what it is. And it was notable because I think it was the only time it appeared in the book. And it's not clear to me that it's a useful term. I have questions about whether or not it's a useful term for a column. Tell me why you think it, or do you think it is?
I suspect that was actually a blog post. And actually, the Times has done something to me. I used to have a blog that was clearly distinct. It was under Times umbrella, but it was clearly distinct from the column. And they changed the format so that digitally they look the same. And so and it's actually kind of inhibiting. It's kind of hard because people may not know that this is, and so I feel a little bit less free to use terms of art in blog posts because a lot of readers are going to not know that that's not my regular column. And so neoliberalism, I mean, I think it is a meaningful term. I think there was a real, but it's not it's a kind of not a term we use in this country.
Yeah.
It's a term that a lot of people outside the U.S. use to refer to this faith in markets, to this belief that privatizing leads to more efficiency. And a lot of people who are at least moderately progressive, at least used to be also neoliberals. There used to be a lot of people who were for market liberalization and free trade, which is a somewhat different subject, but also even for some privatization, but also for strong social safety net. And so I think it's a meaningful term, and probably I think if you asked where was I in 1995, I would have been a neoliberal. I'm much less of one, if probably not one at all now, because I learned something. I mean, I think it's turned out that the world is less. This comes back to the invisible hand. I have a lot less faith in the invisible hand than I used to.
Well, so I have one more question. So for those of you who have questions from the audience, there's 2 mics here, so please feel free to come up. So when Paul, when you reached out to me to do this interview this evening, and I was told I could ask any questions I wanted, I got really excited, and I was going to spend the entire hour talking about how awesome the new pornographers are, and we could talk about all the bands that you like.
Right.
And one of the things that I love about Paul's column is that when he elevates these young indie bands and introduces me to new music that I didn't already know about. And so just to end a bit on a high note, I wanted to know if you could just share with us this evening, like, what is the new band that you're most excited about, so that just tell us.
Oh, okay. So, by the way, this is one of those things. I used to do a blog post every Friday with a band, a performance by a band. I'm a 66-year-old wannabe hipster. I discovered indie music, and now I'm inhibited about that because people will think it's a regular Times article and saying you're using that to promote some band you like, and but where it now appears, so advertisement on my newsletter, which you can subscribe to if you're a Times subscriber. You can subscribe and get an email newsletter. So I now have an indie band performance every week in the newsletter, so I mean there's a couple, but I think probably the ones that I've been really liking, and I like the way I found them too. I was actually so it's this band called Lark and Poe. It's 2 sisters from Atlanta who do blues basically, and I found them by I hadn't been to a concert for a while. None of my usual bands were performing it. There are a few venues in New York, so I just looked at the, Rockwood Music Hall, with the list of future performances, none of which I recognized. So I listened to bits of each of the bands and said, "Oh, I like those people." And so those are, and they got a Grammy nomination several years later. So actually, I wasn't wrong to think there was something there.
So I encourage all of you to sign up for his newsletter. I think you were first, so I'll just go. So I think what I'm going to do, because there's a long line here, is I'm going to take a handful of questions, and then after you ask your question, feel free to sit back down. He will still speak to you, but or if you want to keep standing up here, you can. I always think it's a little awkward when you keep standing. So, but I'll take a few. So go ahead.
So, Paul, my understanding is that you were hired for the Times principally to deal with economic issues. And as time went on, that stretched into a somewhat broader set of policy questions, and then a kind of uber pundit covering quite a bit of territory beyond economics. And I'm curious about foundations and how you think about them. You've talked about becoming less wedded to the earlier orthodoxy of economic theory. By the time you're talking about power and politics more broadly, it's not clear what the anchor is, other than you and I and a lot of people in this room share a lot of the same values for the kind of society that we'd like to see. But I'm curious if it feels different for you when you're talking against a theoretical basis and when you're expanding more broadly into a values discourse.
Okay.
Thank you. And so I'll
We're
take
going to
piece.
accumulate a few.
Yeah.
I'll try to remember those.
I'll write them down too.
Okay, Son. Thanks, Paul, so much for coming down. This has been great. Looking forward to reading your book. Just a quick background. I'm 35 years old. Over the Obama years, I struggled mightily to establish myself. In the last 3 years, I've paid off over 6 figures in student loans and bought a $500,000 condo in D.C., which is 50% black. In this room of liberal elite, there's about less than 2% black people. My main question is, what is I'm open-minded, not a zombie, but I voted for Trump, and I'm wondering, what are 2 or 3 economic policies that could increase the black attendance in this room, or make the black people in my neighborhood able to have a 6-figure salary, such as myself? That's the question. Thank you.
It's a great question. Great question. Go ahead, over here.
Okay, so I count my country as among the victims of the Reagan doctrine of the Washington Consensus, especially in free trade. So my question was, can we count as part of Trump's legacy the fall of the intellectual framework that holds free trade?
Wonderful. And one more, and then I'll...
Why was the drop of the unemployment rate from 10% to 5% under President Obama essentially ignored, while a fall from 5% to 3.5% under President Trump is glorified?
So
you
need me to summarize?
Let me address that first one. Obviously, I'm writing. I hope I'm doing more than just values. Most of my columns are actually pretty analytic. If you actually read them, I'm using pretty vigorous language. But if you actually look, there's always an analytical core. It's not always economics, because I actually talk to people in other fields. I sit in this, among other things, I sit in, as Heather knows, in the Stone Center for the Study of Socioeconomic Inequality, which is a genuine interdisciplinary group. So I actually, Janet Gornick, who runs the center, is a sociologist, at least in part. Leslie McCall is political science. So but in general, I talk. So I lean quite heavily on other social sciences and try to make sure that I'm not just making stuff up, that I'm actually resting on it. So it's still always driven by some aspect of analytics. I've written relatively few, sort of Trump is bad. Trump is a bad person. I don't think I've written any that are just that, not because I obviously have views, but because lots of people are doing that, and I'm trying to actually do a little bit more analytics. Okay, I already lost what the rest of them are.
So one question was, how do we increase black attendance in audiences like this? One about free trade, and then one about why the drop in the unemployment rate wasn't as celebrated under Obama as it is being glorified under Trump.
It's an interesting. It's a shame that this audience isn't more diverse. I try to reach out, and I think there is some. It's also, I'm sure that the average education level in this audience is way above the public. You just do what you can. But God knows, I have I'm not quite even sure what's appropriate to say here. It's not as if I'm disconnected from the non-white community. I'm married into it. So it's not. I hope that there's some connection there, and I do events. I actually I'm fairly heavily involved with Goddard Riverside, which is sort of a traditional settlement house that does a lot of outreach. So I hope that's part of it. And in terms of a strong social safety net, educational opportunity, healthcare, all of these things are important for everybody, but given that America is what it is and our history, they're especially important for non-whites. So I think that this is all, I'm for a lot of things for racial justice that go beyond just economic policies, but even your basic progressive agenda is it's good for a lot of people, but it is disproportionately good for minority groups. Okay, so we had free trade, I think. the thing about free trade, there are some, I think we've seen more about the downsides of globalization than some of us acknowledged. But on the other hand, there are some important upsides, especially, by the way, for poor countries, which desperately need access to global markets. And one of the things I think worth saying is that the global trading system, the set of rules, the ones that Trump is making a mockery of, the roots of that system are actually, they go back to FDR. This was originally a progressive project. It was actually part of trying to make a world that was more integrated, also more peaceful, and rule of law on an international level. So I don't think that you can say that just because Trump is throwing tariffs around that somehow means that he's serving a progressive agenda. It's actually it's in some ways it's a return to the old-fashioned cronyist, corrupt protectionism of the Gilded Age. Still, my short-term memory is my buffer is not big enough here.
Yeah, the last one was about the unemployment rate. Why that got more attention? It's a tough one to answer.
Yeah, and it's do we really need to ask? I mean, it's think about the state television. Otherwise known as Fox News, what they emphasized, so no, it's clearly it's a question of what gets. It is quite remarkable, actually, that you had under Obama, you had starting in 2010, you had an enormous sustained recovery, and it got unemployment down to levels, even by the end of Obama's term, unemployment was in fact below what the Fed had thought was sustainable. So we were already in this territory, but there wasn't a paid cheerleading squad in the way there is now, and a lot of retroactive rewriting of history. So and of course the same people who declared that all the numbers were fake when they were good numbers for Obama are now all don't say that anymore. So that it's not really that hard to understand. I mean, this, by the way, I'm going to extend this a bit. There is, even aside from the specifically U.S. Dynamics, there is this amazing. A lot of the of business and economic reporting still does have a conservative slant, and I see it. One of my minor little cause celebs here is the way that some European countries, particularly France, France gets extraordinary bad press, and you keep on reading. It's actually. One of my colleagues, Roger Cohen, to his credit, he quoted, he wrote something about France like a year or so ago, and he quoted himself saying about how France is, collapsing and it's an impossible economy and it can't sustain itself. And then he said something like, I wrote that in 1986. And if you actually look at the reality, France is not so bad. I mean, in fact, prime-aged adults are more likely to be employed there than they are here. And and if you look at the quality of life, standard of living, but France, because France has really big government and high taxes and generous social programs, it's supposed to be a disaster area. And so a lot of the news media write about it as if it were, even though in fact it's not.
Okay, so we're running out of time. We're going to try to get to these questions. I'm not totally guaranteeing we're going to get to all of them, but this is a plea to be pithy, and I'll take 4 again and see where we are. You, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, this is a question about fiscal deficits. So this is a big argument that's going on between, you on one side saying they really don't matter. Our deficit topped $1 trillion last year. Total debt is over $20 trillion, and it's projected to keep going up at an astronomical rate. And throughout our lives, we're always taught to balance our budget, that you don't want to have a negative account in your checkbook, and that our kids and our grandkids will suffer if they have to pay down the debt. So can you tell me why you're arguing that they don't matter, and if you could share also the counter argument for that Larry Summers is providing, so we could understand the two.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Make a note to myself just so I remember that.
So I'm going to take it back to monetary policy here, so apologies for that. But the current bull market began after the financial crisis. And despite some, recent, fairly recent corrections or quote-unquote recession indicators, it's continued and really shows no sign of stopping. You have asset prices or valuations at historic highs. So my question is, do you believe Fed policy has played a role in sustaining the market? And if so, how big is that role? And if so, do you see it as a problem? Thank you.
Great. Over here.
Hi, with the increase of the gig economy and with automation, what's your thoughts on Andrew Yang's universal basic income, especially when it was said or demonstrated to have failed in the Nordic countries?
Wonderful. And over here?
I just have a quick, simple question. In your opinion, on a scale of 0 to 10, how much is the United States a plutocracy?
Okay.
Great. So why don't you start with that one? I've written them all down, so I'll repeat them for you.
Okay, I actually have been keeping track of myself. Okay. Maybe a 7. I mean, it's not total. We're not full. We haven't gone full oligarch here. Look, under Obama, it's funny that people don't seem to realize, but tax rates on the top 1% went up quite a lot under Obama. In fact, if you believe the CBO, that by the end of Obama's term, they were federal tax rate on the top 1% was about what it was in 1979. So it had effectively, although they're complicated details, but by some measures at least, he had unwound all of the Reagan tax cuts for the rich. So we're not clearly we have hugely disproportionate influence of the wealthy, but it's not total, and it's not impossible. We haven't gone all that way. There is such a thing. Sometimes hard to believe, given the kinds of things I have to write about, but there is such a thing as being too cynical. Okay.
Okay, so there's UBI, there's
so I'm going to do this in reverse order.
Yeah, why not?
First of all, gig economy, that's one of those weird things where it turns out that it hasn't grown nearly as much as people think. So people talk about the gig economy, things like Uber, and the list of things that are like Uber is Uber. That's basically it. And I think one thing that does happen when you have a sort of high socioeconomic status crowd is we don't realize how many people always worked in something like a gig economy. That when I was in Princeton, there were all these Central American men mowing lawns and early in the morning, and how were they hired? The answer is men would stand on street corners in Trenton and get picked up by vans. You, and you. I'll take. And some of the people who did research, Larry Katzen, I've forgotten the co-author, who had said there was a big increase in the gig economy, redid the numbers and said, it's not actually that big an increase. So that's exaggerated. And Andrew Yang, two things. One is his vision is that technological change is rapid productivity growth is eliminating work, except actually productivity growth is the slowest it's been in decades. It's just not there. And the trouble with UBI, I like the idea of as clean and few questions asked of support policy as possible. The trouble with UBI is that either you make it a woefully inadequate sum of money, something that people can't really live on, or it's an enormously expensive program. So I don't think we're in a position to do that. We need much more targeted, means-tested programs, at least for now. Now, if we really were having the robots taking all of our jobs, then we might have to rethink about this issue, but there's no sign that that's happening. So it's funny. Yang portrays himself as, I'm the numbers-driven candidate telling you the truth, except none of the numbers actually support what he says. So
then there's monetary policy or economies and household.
Okay. Yeah, so So clearly asset prices, all kinds of asset prices are high because interest rates are low. The yield on bonds is low, so people are buying other stuff. The question is that because the Fed is doing something artificial? And I don't think it is. I think the point is that we seem to be in a world which is awash in savings with no place to go. And the Fed has to keep interest rates low to not have us in a persistent depression. Now, there's in some ways a better answer would be to give those savings something to go by having a massive infrastructure program and having the federal government. Right now, the real as of yesterday anyway, the 10-year bond rate was 1.52%, which is less than the inflation rate. So basically, people are willing to pay the federal government to take their money. And we should be doing a lot more spending with that. But I don't think that the Fed has done something especially evil or distorting here. Which actually ties in. I thought it was really strange to have trying to make an opposition between me and Larry Summers, because Larry Summers is actually saying exactly the same thing I am on debt now. He's actually calling for deficit spending and lots of infrastructure spending. And that's something that's happened, by the way. I mean, I don't think it was ever the case that serious economists were as remotely as freaked out about debt as Beltway consensus was. I don't think there was ever the whole notion that debt was the greatest threat facing America was something that none of the people I take seriously ever bought into. But there's been a movement now in the last couple of years with the most mainstream of mainstream economists coming around to the view that debt concerns have been greatly overrated. So we have Olivier Blanchard, the former chief economist of the IMF, who is probably the most mainstream person in the economics profession, and the most controlled, careful. Presidential address to the American Economic Association last year was saying, we worry too much about debt. And you have Larry Summers and Jason Furman, who was effectively succeeded Larry as top economist for Obama, saying we actually shouldn't be worrying about debt, and we need to be borrowing to build infrastructure. So no, I'm actually on this stuff. I'm squarely in the mainstream, and the people who think that debt is some existential threat they're inventing economics that doesn't actually come from economists.
Okay, so we are out of time, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let you ask your questions quickly, and then you can pick which one to answer.
Okay.
So it's a bit of I know. So we'll see. So we'll start over here.
There are two trends taking place across almost the entire Western world right now. So one, economic, basically slower growth and widening inequality, and one, political, the rise of the far right. Do you think there's a connection between those two trends? And if so, what is it and what can be done about it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Speaking about zombie ideas, you kind of mentioned power, motives. What about education or lack thereof about economics? Because, I just had two children go through a very good public school system in this area, and it's really not integrated. And then in college, there's just, so many other things going on and other requirements. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts are on teaching economics, whether it should be taught more or differently, or is it, really this kind of side thing that only people interested should be taught?
Hi, I just applied to PhD programs this year, I think generally because of initially reading your columns. And I was wondering, given that the rewards to being an economist at least seem to me pretty, if you care about policy, very skewed to people who have New York Times columns and books, should I do it, or what is the other thing I should do if I shouldn't be an economist?
I didn't quite get that.
Should he become an economist? The answer is yes.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Hi. I was wondering what your thoughts on the... Hi. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the current state of the Eurozone and also what's going on at the BC. That's it. That's the question.
Great. And last one here.
So I was really struck by your comments about kind of moving away, I guess you said, from neoliberalism, and as you've learned over the years and kind of being able to evolve your thinking in a way that, maybe admitting you were wrong in the past, something that I've been thinking a lot about in kind of the upcoming election, my views having shifted a lot in the past 4 years. And I think something that has been difficult for me and probably people in this room to reconcile is that knowing that we may be in an era that really calls for these bigger ideas like the Green New Deal, like you mentioned, while recognizing that, myself included, kind of has both a financial and I guess kind of political stake in the status quo. And so I think my question is really about kind of how you are able to let yourself change your mind. I think it's kind of a difficult ego thing even for me, and how to address people, your friends and family kind of who may not quite be on board without kind of reinforcing the self-fulfilling prophecy of saying an issue like the Green New Deal may not be realistic, whereas that kind of seems to end up being the conclusion if that's the attitude you kind of go into it with.
Well, too much stuff. I'm going to skip the euro, even though I can go on at length, but don't want to do that. And I just want to say that, we should have more economics education, but you can discount what I have to say about that because the Krugman Wells economics textbook AP edition, we actually have about 70% of that market. So I have a conflict of interest. I don't think we fully understand the rise of the far right. It's rising inequality probably is part of it, but it's not such an easy thing. It's not the case that this is where I do talk to political scientists. The people who've gone far right in the U.S., which is where I know the research, tend not, in fact, to be people who've lost. It's there are some, and certainly geographically, it's regions that have lost that have gone hard right. But it's not actually often people who are suffering who are the ones who've gone that way. And there's something going on. I suspect that. I don't have a complete theory, but one of the things that's happened, I do believe that the financial crisis and all of that had the effect of discrediting elites, and that people used to be that people believe, maybe this is kind of a Euro thing as well, because people believed that the European Commission and the great and the good actually knew what was up, and that if they said, don't listen to neo-fascists, that people listen to them. And there's been a huge reputational loss, which has removed one of the great stabilizers in our system. Now, it's harder to do for the U.S. It's not. Maybe that's part of it here as well. But what I would say here is that the hatred was always there. The question is what freed people to express it, what freed people to do it, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that. It's there was always. If you imagine that everyone had really become tolerant, it didn't happen. But somehow or other, all across the Western world, and even in the place, there's a strong white nationalist movement in a lot of Scandinavia too. So it's not clear that even limiting inequality and having a really strong social safety net is enough to prevent that. I don't know what the answer to that question. I'm not sure I answered the question, except to say that it's a big deal, and it's one of those things we need to understand, but we also need to, if possible, head it off, because the future looks pretty scary on that front.
Right, on a positive note, we're ending here. Thank you all so much.
All right.